For our first special address entitled Evolving the Collective Brain, we are honored to have with us Dr. Joseph Henrich, Professor of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University. To introduce him further, please welcome Nicholas Kaur, Director of Research, Khazanah. Nick, please.
Thank you, Shamira. Ladies and gentlemen, first, let me thank Yang Berhormat Dr. Sri Azmin for his opening address. And let me echo Dr. Sharil in welcoming all of you to the 2019 Khazanah Megatrends Forum. Before I introduce Dr. Joseph Henrich, I'd like to just share a very short story. So in graduate school, we learned that the 4 fundamental hypotheses for economic growth are as follows: luck, geography, institutions, and culture. In previous editions of the KMF, we've had a theme that focused on geography and several that focused on institutions. We'd never really gotten around to having one on luck, but it seems a little bizarre to design an entire forum entirely based on the topic of luck. I mean, we're not in Vegas or Genting, so it doesn't really make a lot of sense. But in any case, culture was the hypothesis among the 4 that most fascinated me. And as I began to read more work by economists who work on culture, among whom Dr. Nathan Nunn, who speaks tomorrow, is a superstar, I found myself wondering, how in the world does culture develop? How does it persist? And why does it even come about in the first place? Then one day, I picked up a book called The Secret of Our Success, written by Dr. Joseph Henrich. It's a hardcover, so I actually bought it when it came out. And I'm not kidding. As I delved deeper into the book, everything fell in place and just clicked. And so I excitedly went to share the news of the book with Hisham Hamdan, my boss, who is also an avid reader. And the more we talked about it, the more we realized that this theme of a collective brain was a really, really powerful idea and worth exploring in different shapes and forms at the Khazanah Megatrends Forum. And so we're here today, and so, as well, we have with us here today Dr. Joseph Henrich, the author of The Secret of Our Success. Dr. Henrich is a Harvard professor, the chair of Department of Human Evolutionary Biology, and has been granted academic tenure in four fields. So what have I done with my life? I don't know, but 4 fields: economics, psychology, anthropology, and human evolutionary biology. His research deploys evolutionary theory to understand how human psychology gives rise to culture and how this has shaped our species' genetic evolution. He has conducted long-term fieldwork in the Peruvian Amazon, rural Chile, and the South Pacific, as well as having spearheaded several large comparative projects while researching a wide range of topics, including cooperation, fairness, innovation, religion, marriage, learning, and prestige. In 2016, he published The Secret of Our Success, which has changed my life, and forthcoming in 2020, Look for the Weirdest People in the World, How Westerners Became Psychologically Peculiar and Particularly Prosperous. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Joseph Henrich.
Thanks, Nick. Good morning. Well, it's great to be with you. I'd like to thank the organizers for having me today. And to get us started, I'd like to introduce you to the ideas of the collective brain. I'd like to take you back to a time before the age of industrial technology, before the first cities, and even before the origins of agriculture. Sometime after 100,000 years ago, our species, the African variant of Homo sapiens, began expanding out of Africa. We spread across Eurasia and then through island Southeast Asia and eventually into Australia by 60,000 years ago. By 50,000 years ago, we were pressing into Europe, into the deciduous forests of Europe, driving out our sister species, Homo sapiens neanderthalis. By 40,000 years ago, we were driving into the Arctic, and by 20,000 years ago, we crossed the Bering Strait and spread all the way down to the tip of Tierra del Fuego, where the hunter-gatherers of Tierra del Fuego would later encounter Ferdinand Magellan and a young Charles Darwin on the Beagle. Now, a key question here is, how is our species able to adapt to this immense diversity of environments? In Australia, we adapted to arid deserts. We adapted to frozen tundra in the Arctic, high mountaintops, neotropical forests, and the coastal marshes of southern Chile and Argentina, the Fuegian Peninsula. And this question has often not been addressed, I think, to the degree that it needs to be addressed, because there's a simple, obvious, and I'm going to try to convince you, incorrect answer to the problem. And the idea is that we humans have particularly large brains, those 3.5 times the size of chimpanzees, and many think we are individually good at solving problems. So as we expanded to become the most ecologically dominant species in the world, we did it by putting those big brains to work and individually solving problems. Now, to convince you or to begin to persuade you that there might be more to the story or a more important element to the story than simply our individual ability to solve problems, I'm going to tap into a set of cases that my colleagues and I call the Lost European Explorer Files. These are cases in which Spanish, British, in one case American explorers get stranded in some remote place where hunter-gatherers have been living for centuries or millennia doing just fine. But they struggle to survive, they can't find food, they can't travel, and eventually, unless they're able to prevail upon the locals to assist them, they perish, unable to survive as hunter-gatherers. So the case I want to give you today, it's 1860, and this is the Burke and Wills expedition. If you grew up in Australia, you've probably heard of it. If you haven't, you probably don't know about it. The Worthies in the then British colony of Melbourne decide to put together a public-private partnership with the goal of exploring the interior of the continent, sending an expedition to the Gulf of Carpentaria, up here, I'm not sure if this is going to work, and then coming back. So mixed motives here, goal of exploration, understanding the interior of the continent, but also mapping a pathway for a telegraph. Now, the expedition, the leader was selected, was Robert Burke, who you see pictured here. And they put together an impressive team. It was a very well-funded expedition. It was so well-funded that they were able to import camels from India. And so here you can see camels. Now, during their return trip from the Gulf of Carpentaria, the camels escaped. This may seem like, or some of the camels escaped. This may seem like a trivial point, but it's going to play a role later in our story. Now, I'm going to have to express you through the tale. It's a fabulous story. You can look it up on the internet, or you can read The Secret of Our Success. But a group of 4 men had made it to the Gulf, and on their way back down towards Cooper's Creek, which is a rendezvous point with a resupply group, they had run out of food. They were trying to live off the land. They tried to hunt and gather, but they were largely failing. They ended up eating some of their pack animals. One member of the group was killed under mysterious circumstances. Some think he tried to steal food, and the other members of the group killed him. They finally show up in Cooper's Creek ready for the resupply team, but that team had left because they didn't arrive until they were a month late. So they faced a choice. Either they could try to race and catch up with the resupply team, which seemed unlikely, or they could head to a ranch and police post by following Cooper's Creek to the west. It was a 150-kilometer journey. And it was at a place prophetically named Mount Hopeless. So they begin following the creek, and almost immediately their last camel gets stuck in the mud and dies. So now they're stranded along Cooper's Creek, and they basically have to try to wait it out, hoping for a rescue expedition, because they can't cross the last stretch of desert because they can't find water in the desert, and they need their pack animals to carry the water. So at first things look grim, but then they're able to make friends with some of the locals. And they head into one of the Aboriginal camps, the Yawantru, and they see some of the women processing this sporocarp. They call it a seed in William Wills's journals. So they start looking in the outback for the seed, and they do eventually find it, and they're able to grind it and make a gruel. They make some cakes. They seem to be getting enough calories from the nardu. And they're also getting gifts of fish from the Yawantru, so it seems like things are looking up now. They might be able to make it. The problem is when they were in the Aboriginal camp, they didn't notice that the women were putting these seeds through a processing, rigorous processing to try to detoxify them. So they would grind them, leach them, heat them, and then only eat them with a freshwater mussel shell, or grind them, leach them, and then bake them in ash. And this is crucial because nardu is toxic and indigestible unless properly processed. It contains an enzyme, thiamase, which depletes vitamin B1 in the body and eventually will cause a horrible disease called beriberi. So poor Burke and Wills essentially starved and poisoned themselves on a full stomach. And William Wills's journals were eventually found, and you can see Wills describing the experience of gradually starving to death in his journals. Now, the third member of the group, so Burke and Wills die, the third member of the group stumbles deliriously into the outback and is rescued by the Yuan-Shu tribe, where he recovers, and then he's eventually taken back to Melbourne from the party that returns to rescue them. So what does this tell us? This is interesting because, as I mentioned, humans have lived in Australia for some 60,000 years as hunter-gatherers, but these big-brained explorers, experienced frontiersmen, outdoorsmen, couldn't figure out how to survive. They couldn't figure out how to make the tools they needed, how to catch fish, how to catch kangaroos, how to detoxify plants, figure out what plants they can eat, and most importantly, how to find water in the desert. And it wasn't simply that they had bad luck with the nardu. There are literally hundreds of plants in Australia that they could have eaten that would have also poisoned them. So one example is the Moreton Bay chestnut, which would have poisoned them immediately. Now, they also surely ran across this inconspicuous-looking shrub. So this shrub is called spinifex, and the fact you need to know that on the leaves of spinifex is a crystal, which you can knock off, mix with kangaroo dung, and then heat, and it makes a powerful resin that you can use to make tools. Burke and Wills weren't able to figure that out either. Now, any Yuan-Shu adolescent would have known all of these things. They could have found water in the desert. They would have known how to process the nardu. They could have made tools using the spinifex. So what is the difference here between Burke and Wills, who have big brains, and the Yuan-Shu adolescents? The difference is of course, that the locals have this large body of cumulative cultural knowledge, which is bequeathed to them from previous generation and has accumulated over a long period of time. So this is important. Now, I wanted to get back to the camels. So you might think I've given Burke and Wills too difficult of a challenge here. So how could you survive in the arid deserts? Nobody could do that. Well, I mentioned that those camels escaped. And so now, if you're familiar with the Australian outback, there are thousands of feral camels. So the camels survived the Lost European Explorer Challenge. They were able to find food and water and make their way in the desert and reproduce and make more camels. And they did this because camels come endowed with the ability to smell water from a mile away, innate taste cues which allow them to nibble different plants and figure out what the right plants to eat, and powerful detoxification processes as part of their digestive system that detoxify foods. Human ancestors had those. Chimpanzees can detoxify foods much better than humans, but we've lost them because we've come to rely on cultural knowledge for finding plants and animals that we can eat, or knowing how to detoxify them, or using fire to process them and make them easier to digest. So the question is what are our big brains for if they're not for surviving as hunter-gatherers? So it's commonly pointed out that humans lived as hunter-gatherers for some 2 million years. This is the period on which our brains got big. If there's one thing they should be good at, it should be surviving as hunter-gatherers. And yet we fail the Lost European Explorer Challenge each time. So now the question is, what are they for? So to answer that question, we're going to look at some experimental work from research done at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. This is work done by Esther Herman and Mike Tomasello. And what they did is they did a kind of competition among 3 different great ape species. So the Asian ape, orangutans, chimpanzees, our closest relatives among the great apes, and 2.5-year-old human children here, which is represented by a picture of my son Josh when he was 2 years old. And they gave them a battery of 18 cognitive tasks. Now, these 18 cognitive tasks can be subdivided into tests about space, quantities, understanding causality, and social learning. And in each task, the participants would get rewarded if they could solve the task. So all 3 ape species like food rewards, and they'll work for food rewards. And so if you look at the space tasks, what you can see is that the 2.5-year-old human children and the chimps are about equally good. When trying to figure out how to use space to solve a problem, the chimps and humans do pretty equal. The orangs do a little worse, but not shamefully so. The orangs seem to be doing pretty well. Tests of quantities, similarity again between the humans and the chimpanzees, with the chimpanzees actually edging out the humans. It's within the margin of error, but still a small difference. Also on causality, the chimps slightly outdo the human children. And in fact, if you dig into the subtests of causality, the chimps dramatically outperform the humans on the tests of tool using. You might think humans are particularly good at tool using, but what we're really good at is shown by the next set of bars, where you see that humans trounce the other apes in our ability to learn from others, to watch a demonstrator, infer their motor patterns, infer their goals, and then copy what they're doing. And that seems to be the key thing that differentiates us from these other species, at least when we're making these comparisons that we see here. Now, I think particularly telling here is what happens when you look at the trajectory of the ability to solve these problems over the life course. If we look at the apes, the chimpanzees and the orangutans, they don't get much better as they age. So a 5-year-old chimpanzee is just about as good at solving these problems as a 25-year-old chimpanzee. In the case of humans, we get dramatically better. So if we were to give the cognitive tests to the members of this crowd, you would all be at ceiling. So you would blow the roof off the tests. So something is leading humans to be so much better at these cognitive tasks that we acquire as we grow up. Okay. Now, I just want to jump briefly out of the general narrative here to give you a sense of where I'm going with this, because there's a sense in which we all know we're smarter than these non-human ape species. So part of the argument I'm making here is that we're smarter in part because of a large body of culturally evolved and accumulated information about how to solve problems. And just to give you some examples about what I mean, at various points in human history, we've evolved to use springs and screws and levers and pulleys. And when you grow up in a world that already has these things, they're easy to understand and then redeploy to solve new kinds of problems. They're very difficult to invent for the first time. And I'll give you the example of the wheel. We tend to think of the wheel as something ancient that goes well back into human history, but it's actually emerges relatively late in human history. So 6,000 years ago, it only emerges in Eurasia. It doesn't evolve in Australia, not in New Guinea, not in Oceania, and in the entire New World, the only evidence for the wheel is on Mayan toys. It doesn't seem to have been deployed to use dogs to pull carts, like we see here. But then once you have a wheel, you can, initially they're seen on carts, then they're seen in pottery wheels, later windmills and water wheels, and then gearing, and the idea of the wheel just gets redeployed time and time again to solve new and more complicated problems. Another interesting one is elastically stored energy. So it's probably the case, or at least paleoanthropologists have made the case, that our African variant was able to outcompete the Neanderthals because we came from larger groups in Africa that had invented the bow and arrow. So by the time we were moving into Europe, the Neanderthals, who lived in scattered small groups, had not invented sufficiently complicated technology, and our ancestors, the African variant, wipes out the Neanderthals because we had bows and arrows. Meanwhile, in Australia, the bow and arrow was never invented. New Guineans invent the bow and arrow, but never fletching. So these are things that are invented at certain times, and once you figure out elastically stored energy, you can invent spring traps, and then there's a whole set of other inventions that go along. Just to give you 2 more quick examples, everyone in this room, English speakers, can count without bounds. So we can just keep counting as high as you want to go. The group I worked with in Peru counts 1, 2, 3, many. And so there's no 7 or 8 or anything like that. In New Guinea, you can find a number of different groups that some count to 12, some can count to 27. These are always body part counting systems. So each finger has a label, and that becomes a number, and then you can kind of count up and down your body. But then the trick is to get that to cycle and develop a system around that. But once you have that, you can do all kinds of cool things, like differentiate 53 from 54. Finally, I'll mention one of my favorites, the notion of using a symbol to represent nothing. Very difficult to figure out. As far as we know, only figured out twice in human history. Once in India, where it then was transferred to Islamic societies, and then eventually into Europe, and the second time in the New World among the Maya. Okay, and then there's a whole bunch of other concepts that gradually get accumulated over human evolutionary history. So the argument I'm making, that I make in The Secret of Our Success, is that it's not our intelligence, our individual ability to solve problems, our raw brain power, but rather our ability to accumulate a body of knowledge over time. So this is the notion of culture. Culture is the information that we acquire by learning from others. And these, because of the way we learn from others, can give rise to what I'll call cultural adaptations. More about those in a minute. But as soon as you realize that we're so dependent on learning from each other to do even the basic aspects of human survival as hunter-gatherers, going back hundreds of thousands of years, the notion of collective brain emerges. Larger and more interconnected populations will produce fancier tools, more complex cultural adaptations, fancier language, and more complex institutions. And then finally, what I'm not going to spend time getting into today, but which you can always read more about in The Secret of Our Success, is the notion of culture-driven genetic evolution. So in The Secret of Our Success, I make the case that much of our physiology, biology, and the expansion of our human brains has been driven by cultural products. So humans invent fire and cooking, and that shapes our teeth and our jaw muscles, makes our stomachs smaller, and shrinks our colons. Because fire essentially allows us to do external digestion, so we don't need to worry about that. We can offload it into culture. Okay, now, I thought it would be useful just to make you aware of a kind of quiet revolution that's going on within the social and life sciences, which is for a long time, there were two ways of approaching humans that butted heads. Evolutionary biologists wanted to apply natural selection, thinking about using the tools, the Darwinian tools, to think about human behavior, the same ones that we use to think about non-human behavior. And this runs up against other social science disciplines which want to say it's about socialization and culture and learning. Well, what two different teams during the late 1970s and early 80s began doing is they said, let's think about how natural selection and genetic evolution has shaped our capacities for culture, our ability to learn from each other. And so the way this goes is you can use the logic of natural selection to make hypotheses about how we learn. So that's who we learn from, what kinds of things we pay attention to, and when we rely on different sources of information. So when do we rely on our own experience? When do we rely on culture from our forebears? And when do we rely on our innate instincts? And so we can develop an understanding, we have now over 30 years, a deeper and deeper understanding of how we learn, how kids learn, who they learn from, and how culture changes over time. And then this can feed back on genetic evolution. Now it's these evolved cognitive mechanisms that are very particular about who we pay attention to and what kind of information we pay attention to that allow culture to be adaptive. So that's the idea here, that we have these adaptive learning mechanisms that filter ideas over time. And one of the points I want to make is that although we can think about this in a very active way, we want to increase our collective brain so we can do more very conscious, innovation-driven, this has been happening unconsciously outside of our awareness well deep into our species' evolutionary history. So all the time, we're constantly learning from each other without even realizing it. It's easy to do experiments where you can get people to do one thing or another by exposing them to models, people they learn from. When you ask them why they did it a particular way, they never say, oh, I just copied the prestigious person. They'll come up with some explanation. This means that these cultural adaptations, we don't have a causal understanding for why they work. They just work and with a process that's going on in the background. And in fact, sometimes understanding them causally might be negative. So let me just give you one example. So, and this is appropriate given the tasty Malaysian cuisine that I've been experiencing. So when biologists first began to look at spices, so here I'm thinking of Paul Sherman and Jennifer Billings' work, they wondered, why do humans use spices so often and non-humans don't seem to use spices? And their first question was, what are spices? It turns out that most spices are the chemical defenses evolved in plants to kill bacteria, funguses, and to keep other animals away from them, keep them from eating them. So they're supposed to be unpleasant for other animals and to be able to kill bacteria and fungi. So they developed a hypothesis that humans, outside of our conscious awareness, had been gradually selecting recipes and tastes over many generations as a way of killing the pathogens in food, specifically meat, and making meat healthier and safer than it would otherwise be. And so there's a variety of lines of evidence that confirm this. One is simply that the most commonly used spices, things like onions and garlic and chili peppers, are very antimicrobial. So they kill between 75 and 100% of the pathogens they've been put up against. But the other interesting piece of evidence, and maybe particularly interesting for this group, is that if you look at the mean temperature of a country, the mean annual temperature, and you look at its spicing recipes, so you analyze the cookbooks from different societies, so this is based on 4,000 cookbooks. If you look at the top plot, the proportion of recipes that have some spices in them, you can see that as it gets hotter, more and more of the recipes have spices. And by the time you get to really warm places, every single recipe has spices in it. And then if you look at the spices per recipe, the number of different spices in the recipe goes up as the climate gets hotter and hotter. And it's important to use different spices because not all spices kill all pathogens. So if you have a collection of spices, you have a kind of portfolio, an ensemble for attacking all the pathogens that you might face in your foods. Okay. So this is, now, so most people who use spices don't realize that they're actually making their food safer by killing pathogens. They've just learned to cook certain ways. They've acquired tastes by cultural learning and experience in certain environments. But this has a prophylactic effect. And the secret of our success is full of examples like this. Okay, so this leads us to the collective brain. Because as a species we've become so reliant on learning from each other, the size of our populations and the interconnectedness has a big effect on our ability to produce these adaptations like the spices in food. So our cultural part of our nature is that we learn from others, and our social part of our nature is that we live in groups. And the bigger and more social a group we can live in, the fancier stuff we can do. So that's just this point. High-fidelity cultural transmission is important. If things are noisy, then you need an even bigger collective brain. And then finally, the sociality. So to test this, there's been a number of us working on this now for several years. This is research done by two anthropologists, Michelle Klein and Robert Boyd. And what they did is, it's very difficult on continental populations to really get a good measure of a population size that you can assign discretely to a community. But by going to Oceania, you're able to use islands and get population figures for different islands. And what they did is they went to the early ethnography for societies throughout Oceania and looked at the marine foraging technology. And they coded all the different ways in which people caught fish, the different tools they had, how many of those tools they had, and the complexity of those tools. And they compared the different islands. So what you see on this plot is on the horizontal, we have the population size of these different islands in Oceania on a log scale. And the vertical axis on the left plot is the number of tools. So the islands with larger populations had more total marine foraging tools. And the other plot shows that on average, those tools were more complex. So techno units, you'll see there on the vertical axis. That just means the number of different parts the tool is composed of. So more tools and more complex tools. They also looked at the amount of contact that these islands had, how remote. You know, are you Easter Island or one of the Melanesian islands where you would have a lot more contact? And islands that had greater contact with other islands they had more tools than you would expect based on their population size. So it's as if their collective brain was a bit larger because they're interconnected with other islands. So both of those come through in the analysis. Now, that's only 10 data points, and you might be thinking, well, we're interested in innovation in the modern world, so what do we care about a bunch of Polynesian islands? You can do the same thing if you look at U.S. cities. So this is U.S. cities with more than 10,000 people, log scale, so the working age population along the horizontal, and inventions based on patent applications. So larger U.S. cities produce more innovation, at least as measured by patents, and the relationship is super linear. So my preferred way of interpreting this, if you take the exact same person and you put him in a bigger city, they're more likely to invent something. And I'll give you some experimental evidence consistent with that in a second. Now you can add various kinds of controls, education and things like that, and this basic relationship holds. But we have another way of attacking this and trying to figure out if the causal story that I'm telling you here actually works out. We try to create micro-societies within the laboratory in experiments. So there's now been a number of experiments like the one I'm going to show you, and they all tell basically the same story. So what we did in this experiment, I did this with Michael Muthu Krishna, is we got 100 undergraduates at the University of British Columbia, and we gave them a challenging task. So in this first example, the challenging task is replicating that target image you see there at the bottom. Now, they're paid for their performance, so they're using a notoriously user-unfriendly image editing program, and they've got to reproduce the target image. They have a time limit, so they've got to do as well as they can in the limited time. They are paid for their performance, and also of their students. So they're going to be allowed to write a couple of pages about what they learned during the experiment and pass it down to some students. Now, the crucial treatment here is shown there on the upper right. You'll see that in one condition, we just had a first generation that had to do the best they could, and then they could pass knowledge down to each subsequent generation for 10 generations. And so in the non-interconnected treatment, you just have one teacher you can learn from, and it just follows a line down. In the other treatment, this is a highly interconnected group. Each member of subsequent generations can learn from anybody in the prior generation, so they have access to all the potential teachers. Now, after they finish, each person then writes up their tips for the student, and they're incentivized to do that with pay. So the next generation receives the model's product, so whatever image they made, hopefully it looks like that target image. They also get the target image and then the 2 pages of tips. Okay, so this is the result. So along the horizontal axis, we have the generations. So these are laboratory generations. One group of undergrads comes in, they do it, they leave, another group comes in, they get the tips, they get a shot at it. And if you look at the non-interconnected group where you can just learn from, one cultural parent, you don't have any accumulation. So the vertical axis is the skill measure. So that's how close whatever target you make is to the original target image that you were trying to replicate. And so you show no accumulation there. That's the blue line. If you look at the red line, where you could learn from anybody, you see that you get much better over time. And in fact, by round 10, the people in the more interconnected group are twice as good at this in reproducing the image as the people in the linear group, in the one model group. Okay, I can give you a little look at the raw data here, and I think this is interesting. So if you look at the top row, going down to the bottom row, goes from generation 1 to generation 10, and then you have the 1 model, the not very interconnected group on one side, and the 5 model is the more interconnected group. And if you look at the 1 model group, you can see that they had a good first round, so they got some people who were able to do pretty well, but then that doesn't accumulate. The next rounds, they lose that good start they had. Meanwhile, in the 5 model group, you can see they had a terrible first round, and things don't get much better on the second round, but then one individual gets it. You can see him there on the far third row, far right, and then almost all the guys on the next row get it, and then they're off and running, and cumulative cultural evolution pushes them. And it pushes them so far that the worst person in the interconnected group is better than the best person in the non-interconnected group. So they've been able to generate this skill. Now, it's worth thinking about the kind of thought experiment where if you have different societies and one's interconnected and one's not, and you were to arrive in one society, you might think the people here are much smarter than the people over there. But what you're seeing is the effect of sociality. You're seeing the interconnectedness among minds, not the quality of individual minds. In this experiment, people are randomly assigned to treatment groups. Now, one of the questions we asked ourselves was whether the individuals in the five model treatment, where you could copy any of the individuals from the previous generation, whether people were just picking out the best player and learning from them, or whether they were somehow sampling more widely, learning from a number of different models. So we broke the image, the target image, down into these binary parts, and we looked at the models that each individual could have looked at, and we saw if having a model that had that trait, based on the model's ranking, predicted the learner getting that when they made their trait. And what we found is that learners used 4 out of the 5 models. So they ignored the worst person, and they used the best person the most, with kind of declining in proportion to skill. And this is important because it means you can have innovation without invention. So without individuals actually coming up with anything new on themselves, they take one thing from this guy and one thing from this guy, they make something new. And so you get better things than you could get otherwise. Okay, so one of the things that comes out of the mathematical models that we use to model the collective brain is that it should be possible for there to be a loss in skill, a loss in know-how, a kind of decline in the collective knowledge of the group. So to do that in the context of our experiment, what we did is we trained subjects in the first round to be really good at it. And so we just gave them as much direct training as we could to get them as close to 100% as possible. And this was, in this case, we used a complex knot tying task. So they had to learn a series of rock climbing knots and then use it to lift a chair up. So that's the measure of the mean knot tying skill. So you have generations along the horizontal and average skill along the vertical. And so what this shows is that initially they start high, which is a good check. It means we train them up good. But when you're not very well interconnected, you have a sharp decline in your skill. When you're more interconnected, your skill declines more slowly. And what we think is happening here is there's an equilibrium level of skill given the population size and interconnectedness. So the larger and more interconnected your population, the greater amount of knowledge you can hold and sustain through time. If you get smaller, you're going to start bleeding off that knowledge, and you're going to go to a new equilibrium level of complexity. And so you can see these groups are coming to these equilibria, and just is purely due to their interconnectedness. So just not to overemphasize this, but we know there's no intelligence differences here. We've randomly assigned a treatment group. It's not incentives. Everyone's getting paid for performance in the same way. So it's only sociality. So it's just the interconnectedness that matters. Now, you might think that this can't happen in the real world, but I was actually inspired to begin thinking about this because of a famous anthropological case. So in the island of Tasmania, before about 12,000 years ago, so this is an island off the southern coast of Victoria in Australia. It was previously a peninsula of Australia. And as the seas rose at the beginning of the Holocene about 10,000 years ago, the Bass Strait, which separates Tasmania from mainland Australia, flooded. And Tasmania became isolated for the ensuing 10,000 years. And based on archaeology, it looks like people began losing valuable tools and technologies over time, including bone tools, wooden tools, watercraft. And if you compare the Tasmanians to the mainland Aboriginal Australians in Victoria, the mainland Victorians have much more complex tools, fancy boats, canoes, multi-piece tools, whereas the Tasmanians have single-piece spears, simple clothing. They don't have fitted clothing the way the Australians do. So this appears to be a case of long-term cultural deterioration due to geographic isolation. Another famous case is the Polar Inuit in northern Canada. So the Polar Inuit don't actually live at the pole, they live in northern Greenland, and they get hit by a disease, which may have been introduced by a European explorer named John Ross, and this disproportionately wipes out the elders in the community, the kayak-making experts, and some of the other tool-making experts. And the group then doesn't have the knowledge, and they can't regenerate this knowledge. And so they actually become isolated, in some sense marooned in northern Greenland, because without seaworthy kayaks, they can't reconnect to the other Inuit groups, which would give them the cultural knowledge that they lost. Then finally, so this is like 1821 when this happens, by 1860, a Baffin Inuit, so from an Inuit from a different part, finally bumps into the Polar Inuit, they reconnect, and the Polar Inuit regain all these lost bits of technology. So it's another case where a sudden shock can cause you to lose a lot of cultural know-how. So I've been kind of presenting this as kind of know-how, technology, tools, and that's the easiest way to sort of send the basic points. But this process, the collective brain, should influence many aspects of culture. So one of the aspects of culture that it can influence is language. If you had an education like I did, you probably learned that all languages are equal, and that's in some sense true. But as you'll see, when you actually do the numbers, there's a lot of interesting differences. So the predictions are basically when you have a larger speaker community, you should be able to maintain more words. You should lose words less frequently. You could have more phonemes, and you should be able to transmit information more efficiently. A larger group should hone the language more to make it more transmissible over time. And so what I've shown here on this graph is that languages with larger speaker populations have more phonemes. I could show you the same thing for word loss and word gain based on studies in Polynesia. Phonemes are interesting. So the small-scale human societies have as few as 11 or 12 phonemes in their language. And some African languages have 140 phonemes, including a variety of clicks. Also, recent research using digitized corpuses show that languages with more speakers have more informationally efficient languages. So for the number of syllables and the amount of semantic meaning you get out of it seems to increase depending on your population size. So just coming back to a theme I started earlier, is that cultural practices can evolve to fit our minds and bodies because they're gradually passed on over time according to what works. So to give you one example is spatial reference systems. Many of us, or all of us, have the ability to use left and right. And that comes as part of learning most languages today. But when we look at the diversity of human languages, we find that some languages don't make the distinction between left and right. And human children struggle to learn left and right, and it often takes them a while to get left and right. Training animals to distinguish left and right, non-humans, is difficult. So what seems to have happened over time is languages gradually aggregated tools for thinking about space. So English has 3 different reference systems. So it has absolute reference, north, south, east, and west. Relative reference, which, well, object-centered reference, which is objects have, like a building has a front, a right, and a left. And there's also relative reference. So between me and the camera, I can then reference left or right, front or back. Other languages just have absolute coordinate systems, so north, south, east, and west. So there's an aggregation of tools for thinking about the world and thinking about space. And this gives us a new cognitive ability, telling right from left, which allows us to solve all kinds of new problems. Another interesting case is the mental abacus. And to understand the power of the mental abacus, you need to first think about the abacus itself. So the abacus evolved over thousands of years, probably from Babylonian counting boards. And when neuroscientists and psychologists, perception psychologists, have analyzed the abacus, it seems organized to take advantage of how our minds naturally group things and how they group things in space. So it allows us to perform these calculations using the abacus by taking advantage of some basic aspects of the human mind. But then the mental abacus means that you can train children to use the abacus and then eventually put the abacus aside. And the children can perform amazing computations, sometimes beating people on calculators. And when they're doing it, they're clearly manipulating a visual representation of the abacus in their mind, and actually they kind of move their fingers around as they're making the calculations. And this allows them to make extraordinary calculations, giving them a cognitive ability that you never would have guessed, but in this case can be bootstrapped up by using this technology. And then finally, I'll mention, many people aren't aware that IQs have been rising. And this has been hidden from us because the IQ test is normed. So we always make the norm 100, and then you have standard deviation of 15. But if you go back to the earliest IQ test, which the data comes from the US, and you use the original scores, IQs all over the world have been rising. And as much as so, the US IQ has risen 30 points since the earliest records, just after 900. You might think, well, maybe this has to do with schooling, maybe the knowledge is better, so we would expect an increase in crystallized IQ. But actually, pattern recognition, things that psychologists have long thought were basic aspects of our intelligence, have been rising dramatically. And this can't be due to genetic evolution. The time frame is too short. So it has to have something to do with people adapting to the worlds they face. So one interesting case of this is if you look at TV shows since the 1950s, the plots have gotten much more complex. Today, children watch a TV show and they have an ensemble cast with many different subplots going on. But if you look at the TV shows from the 1950s, it's basically one plot and 4 characters. It's very simple. So just the amount, the world, the complexity of the world they're confronting affects our minds and has increased fluid IQ by a large amount. Okay, so putting together some of the ideas here of the collective brain, one of the core ideas is that innovation is driven by the recombination of ideas from the interaction of diverse minds. So one of the things my colleague Michael Muthu-Krishnan and I are doing is we've gone back to the great inventions. So we've found lists of the great inventions in human history. And we've tried to code those as to what they're recombining. So to give you an example, the Gutenberg press. He took cheese presses, and he took an idea from a Dutch printer. He had an apprentice in his shop who had used wooden movable type. And his father had worked in a mint where he had a knowledge of soft metals. And so he took the idea of wooden movable type from the Dutch, he took his knowledge of soft metals from his father, and he took the ideas for cheese and wine presses from the local cultural milieu, and he puts that together to form the Gutenberg press, which leads to the print revolution, energizes Protestantism. Another example is the steam engine. So the Industrial Revolution is powered by the steam engine, and Newcomen puts together the first steam engine. And he gets his ideas from a Denis Papin, a Huguenot, who is fled from France because of religious oppression. So the Industrial Revolution probably didn't happen in France because they drove the Huguenots out, who took a bunch of know-how, went to England. Denis Papin was one of them, and he took the idea of the pressure cooker, which he wrote a book about, and the idea of the compression gun. And so the steam engine, at least Newcomen's steam engine, is a combination of those two things. The Newcomb steam engine wasn't that great, but James Watt got a hold, he was asked to fix the Newcomb steam engine, and then he adds that extra compressor that's outside. And that leads to that powers the Industrial Revolution, literally. So that's just a sense in which the power of recombination and a good dose of serendipity. Now, the other thing that's important here is anything that can create broad interconnectedness among diverse minds. So, and it's more important to have diverse minds interconnecting than it is to have people who have the same knowledge base and the same beliefs and the same values. It's because it's the recombination of different ideas. If you have two individuals with identical thoughts and knowledge, there's nothing to recombine. So you need to bring different ideas together, and that's going to lead to innovation. Relational flexibility. So in my new book, The Weirdest People in the World, I look at the origins of the Industrial Revolution in Europe. And what I find is there was an increase in the level of trust and new voluntary associations based on science and other shared interests that brought individuals together. So if you look at England and you look at where the innovation happened, it can be predicted by the existence of these societies where diverse, unrelated individuals would get together and talk about science and the latest findings. So the importance of interconnectedness. Key is trust in strangers. So people have to have a willingness to share ideas, and that's because that's what creates the recombinations. All right. Okay, I just wanted to, before I close, to come back to one of the main ideas that wraps up the book. And that's the idea that we're actually a species driven by two different inheritance systems. So as I mentioned early on, the way to think about this is that genetic evolution shaped our minds to make us better cultural learners so we can learn from other people, and that's one of the main ways we get our information. But then cultural evolution takes off and begins producing stuff. Genetic evolution runs in parallel. So for example, over 1 million years ago, humans figured out how to use fire, engage in food processing, use tools to cut food and cut meat. That allowed us to have larger brains because you needed to be able to learn the information for cooking. It also gave us calories in order to power those brains. But we also gained greater dexterity. So unlike other primates, we have cortical connections that run directly into our hands. So we have a lot more control over our fingers than apes. We can thread needles and they can't. Okay. So we have two intertwined coordinate systems. Another thing that humans evolved is we have the ability to use projectile weapons. And then our shoulders evolved such that we're good throwers. So other apes can't throw fastballs and they can't throw really well, but we have a redesigned anatomy that allows us to throw things. So that's a case of gene culture coevolution. Humans evolved water containers, which allowed us to engage in long-distance pursuit hunting. So anthropologists studying small-scale societies, hunter-gatherers, have found that some hunters can chase down prey, chase down antelope. And it's because we have a body that's been designed to be able to engage in long-distance running. So we have springy arches and sweat glands all over our body that cool us as we run. Other apes, other animals can't do this. And the reason we can do this is because of water containers. So we can carry and find water to power our sweat system to keep us cool so we can engage in long-distance running. And there's been lots of other changes along the way where you can find cultural developments in the archaeological record and then corresponding anatomical, physical changes in human bodies. So the overall story here is that human brains evolved. The reason we have those big brains is that our brains are for acquiring, storing, and retransmitting cultural information. Okay. Thanks for listening, everyone.